A silent death awaits Nubia in southern Egypt once the Egyptian major project, the High Dam at Aswan, has raised the level of the waters of the Nile by about 65 meters between Aswan and Wadi Halfa, the town by the Sudanese frontier, to form Lake Nasser. UNESCO's salvage operation all started when Vattenbyggnadsbyrån, a Swedish company acting as consultants on behalf of the United Arab Republic, examined an Italian proposal. This plan meant lifting the temples in their entirety with the aid of 500 jacks, 65 meters up in the air, at an approximate cost of $80 million. This was too expensive, and therefore Vattenbyggnadsbyrån produced a plan of its own, in which both temples were to be dismantled into blocks weighing a maximum of 30 tons, which would then be put together again on a plateau further up. The new site was to be in exactly the same relation as before to the sun, which has always penetrated, twice yearly, the innermost of the 16 rooms in the great temple, with RAMSES sitting with the gods Amon and Rearakti. The cost of this proposal, which was approved by all the parties concerned, amounted to $36 million. Before a start was made on the dismantling of the temples, a coffer dam was constructed in order to keep out the rising waters of the Nile from the site. Apart from this, the extensive technical preparations were unique of their kind. Water that seeped through the cofferdam was collected in large tunnels under the site and pumped out by a central pumping plant. In order to get at the temple rooms in the hillside, it was necessary to excavate the rock above the temples. About 130,000 cubic meters of rock fill were removed. At the new temple site, about 320,000 cubic meters of rock fill were required for the artificial hills around the temples alone. They turned it into a... In parts, the sandstone rock was so soft that the cutting could be done with a wire saw. Then it was like cutting through a piece of cheese. During the opening phase of the operation, the facades were covered with fine sand drift as a protection against falling stones and other objects. Gradually, a very big logistics branch grew up to cope with the needs of the sites.
Up! Up! Okay, Alatul! Forza! Forza!
When the first engineers landed at Abu Simbel, they had to fend for themselves entirely in this enormous expanse of desert, 300 kilometers from Aswan. However, they turned it into a small paradise with detached stone houses and gardens. They even installed air conditioning and bathrooms with running hot and cold water. You get an inspiring view from the air of what human hands have created anew from the dormant sea of sand of the Sahara. This seemingly humble stone hut housed an ultra-modern shop with refrigerated counters and other necessary equipment to supply the needs of the many engineers. It took the Egyptian team of builders about 2 months to build a Hilton-type swimming pool on an Olympian scale. The flags of the 15 visiting nations with the flag of the host country, Egypt, on top of the marine-like entrance, flew proudly over the completed recreation area. The flags symbolized the 16 nations comprising the company joint venture Abu Simbel and the salvage operation itself. The swimming pool became the real meeting place for the families and for the engineers in search of relaxation after a hard day's work. One of the most popular ways of spending leisure time was an excursion by boat on the Nile, calling at one of the many archaeological excavation sites. Gabel Adda looked like a moon landscape, and it made a good photograph for the family snapshot album back home. In cases where the cuts made by the ingenious powered saws were too large, special Swedish hand saws from the Sandviken Company of Sweden were used. Cooperation between the many representatives of the various nationalities was essential to make the work go smoothly. Many times, comical situations arose when drawing in the sand or gesticulating wildly were the only means of getting what one wanted. A derrick crane was used to lift heavy blocks with deformed bars, which were inserted and firmly fixed in the blocks, once their center of gravity had been carefully worked out. The blocks were put on a specially built low loader and taken to a storage depot, there to await the re-erection of the temples. Inside the temple rooms, steel scaffolding was erected in a certain way in order to counteract the variations in pressure that arose during the course of excavation. This method facilitated the smooth running of the work of re-erection at the new temple sites. Gradually, as the work progressed, the protective sand was removed, and the huge colossi outside the temples were uncovered. The dismantling took considerably less time than had been estimated. The pictures show how the chest section of one of the 20-meter-high colossi of RAMSES outside the entrance to the Great Temple is lifted and placed on one of the waiting special low loaders. It was particularly important that the road up to the storage area was in good condition. For this reason, an Egyptian subcontractor was hired especially, and for almost a year they were busy laying asphalt roads inside the area with what may at first sight appear extremely primitive equipment. Nevertheless, the road was good enough for the 50-ton low loaders. The main storage area had a special type of crane which could move on rails around the whole area and load and unload the blocks with the greatest precision. If the waiting time was too long for certain blocks, they were covered over with straw mats as a protection against the sun and wind. Any cracks in the ornamented surfaces of the blocks were sealed or reinforced with injections by a team of Egyptian workers. This is where the temples will eventually rise once more and will finally be covered by artificial hills. A small private ceremony, attended by the Egyptian resident engineer, El Sheltawi, and the project manager, Mr. Meckel, was held when the first block was placed in position at the new site of the Great Temple. These were busy days for the survey department, for theirs was the great responsibility to see that the blocks were put in the right position, even if they had an abundance of equipment to help them to achieve this aim. The final phase of the dismantling is at hand, and there remain, symbolically, 2 pairs of RAMSES feet outside the Great Temple. The removal of the Temple of Nefertari, built in honor of RAMSES' favorite wife, and named the Small Temple for the purpose of the project, has been completed. The skillful engineers were working at top pressure, and it was therefore a great relief to everyone to see the last foot of RAMSES being cut out with true professional skill to get the 3,200-year-old pharaoh to take his last steps ever from the ancient banks of the Nile. The empty caves in the old cliff by the Nile, left by the two temples, bear witness to the fact that the costliest race in the history of the world between technology and the rising Nile was won by technology, thanks to admirable cooperation between world organizations, countries and technicians, who saved an irreplaceable cultural monument for posterity. All that the technicians left behind them after they had finished their work was the small town in which they had lived while the operations were going on. Perhaps this town, in its turn, will be excavated in some thousands of years' time and renamed as yet another prehistoric relic for Egypt. The journey home began along the Nile, and it's with a certain sadness that many leave bonds of friendship which were forged under the severe conditions in which they lived. The sinking palms that pass by, fighting as they are their last battle before the Nile swallows them up completely, as small silent symbols of the success of Egypt's greatest technological project, the High Dam, and of its approaching fulfillment. Despite the high dam and the rising Nile, boats ply along the river as before. This just goes to show that life goes on, and that technology has in no way displaced the ancient boats of the Nile, sailing calmly on, undisturbed by modern hydrofoils. As we pass the sinking villages, it's almost possible to see the sadness in the eyes of the Nubian member of our crew as he gazes out over the disappearing world of his fathers. It's really very fitting to recall here the words, "From mud did they come, and to mud have they returned."